At least 3 people will die today in the United States because of the police. And the death investigation system in this country is complicit in upholding injustice. My name is Brittany Page, and this is the Page Perspective. And that alarming fact that at least 3 people will die today in the United States because of police violence is just one of the many alarming facts that I learned in this newly released book, The Coroner's Silence: Death Records and the Hidden Victims of Police Violence by Dr. Terence Keel. Dr. Keel is an award-winning scholar, the founding director of the Biocritical Studies Lab, and a professor of human biology, society, and African American studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. This book covers many things: the history of the death investigation system, the complicit work of medical examiners and coroners in upholding systemic abuses by making deaths in custody appear natural and ensuring the state is protected above all else. And solutions. Dr. Keel covers solutions. You'll see in this interview that Dr. Keel is hopeful about change, and I not only left this conversation more hopeful and more educated, but I felt the same after reading this book. This book is out now, and you can grab your copy in the link in the pinned comments or anywhere you get books. But for now, please enjoy this important conversation with Dr. Keel. Dr. Keel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be on the show.
This book is such an important one. It's hard to read, but you can tell all of the work that you put into it, all of the research that you've done. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but there's a lot to fit in because this goes really deep. I do want to start, though, with something that you cite in the book, which is really powerful. You write that at least 3 people will die today because of the police. And that's, you wrote that sentence in the book because every day that is the expectation, that's just based on the statistics. Can you take us through who these victims might be and what the investigations of their deaths are likely to look like?
Yeah, absolutely. That statistic actually is a difficult one to kind of wrap our heads around, because as it turns out, there are really 5 people who die every day in police custody, either during arrest or in jail, but we're really ever only going to know the names of 3 of those people. And so when you really think about that, that's over 1,200 people that are dying every year in police custody. And it was something that as I began to think about this project and began to work with people and impacted families and organizations around the country on this issue, it was a statistic that was staggering for me to discover. Mm-hmm. We don't often think about the totality of the lives that are being lost in police custody. And really the tragedy that I discovered doing this research and writing the book is that a lot of the people who are dying in police custody are people who have been failed many times over by local, state, and national government. And what I mean by that is that these are people who are dying in police custody who are suffering from mental illness, who are living in cities where they can't find wages that can compete with inflation. They're living in cities and counties that have a lack of affordable housing. They're
Right.
living in places where the states are trying to reduce Medicaid and Medicare coverage for people. So these are deaths that are happening, and tragically, we're using law enforcement to police away these social problems. A lot of the people that I write about in the book would still be with us if they lived in states, cities, and counties, and quite frankly, a nation that prioritized care over policing.
Yeah, and you can see behind me where it says poverty is a policy choice, right? And so many of those things that you just listed are policy choices, disinvestments. We're not making those investments in the community, in community health, to ensure that people are able to get the help that they need. And if it's something like poverty or mental illness or drug addiction, instead, those people are being met with the policing that then could possibly end their life. And I think that is something that you make really clear in your book. One thing that we don't hear a lot about, we hear a lot about the staggering number of deaths at the hands of police. We see headlines of police abuses, I mean, from things like the New York Times expose several years ago now, maybe a decade ago, about test-lying. It became so common that police are lying on the stand that they had a term for it, test-lying, to body cams revealing just how often the police are lying. I think what your book really exposes is how it goes deeper than that it's actually coroners and the death investigation process itself where there is dishonesty and covering for state abuses. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect?
There was a time in this country when someone died under mysterious or unusual circumstances, let's say in the 1830s. What a local coroner would have done is that they would have gathered 12 white men, because white men were considered citizens at the time. And those white men would have constituted what they call an inquest, a coroner's inquest jury. And they would have gotten together, looked at the body, and had a conversation about who is this person? When was the last time we saw them alive? Were there anyone passing through town that might be suspicious or someone that we might want to pursue to being accountable for this death? Was there an epidemic or something happening within the region? The coroner would gather all this information, and these juries would actually determine who was accountable and who to charge, what actual charge there was to be brought against this person who have taken this person's life. And that would have set into motion law enforcement investigation. So very early in our nation's history, the coroner system was this sort of multifaceted political institution that worked with community and worked with the expertise of people on the ground.
And not clouded in secrecy.
Absolutely, not crowded in secrecy. It was direct democracy in the exact sense of the word.
Right.
But what begins to happen after emancipation, after the end of Reconstruction in particular, when we expand the franchise of democracy to formerly enslaved African people, to Asian populations, to indigenous people, to multiple types of people in our democracy, the coroner becomes a system that gets further removed from the public. States around the nation start changing the laws and modernizing the coroner to become a medical examiner. Now, on the one hand, this is a good thing because you didn't have to have a medical license to actually do an investigation prior to the 19th century. So there is some positive benefits to modernizing death investigation. But the downside of this is that it became less of a democratic institution, where now we have inherited a system where medical examiners are appointed by local officials or by state officials. That could be a governor's office or a board of supervisors. They often don't run for office, which means they're not directly accountable to the public. They are instead accountable to the local officials that pay their bills, that employ them. And that creates an inherent conflict of interest when law enforcement are ending people's lives on the street during arrests, or people are dying in jail, and the same board or the same local officials that have to pay financial settlements to families who sue when this happens are also paying the medical examiner. And you can see that sets up an incentive to downplay and minimize police violence, and tragically blame often the victims for their own death. And this is something that I discovered in the book. In many cases, the medical examiner they are weaponizing the pre-existing health conditions, the substance abuse issues, the mental health issues, and making that the reason why someone died in custody, not the actual violence of police.
What was it that brought you to the death investigation process to look at this lack of accountability, to look at this secrecy, to look at the role that they're playing in upholding some of these barriers to justice?
There were two really important moments. I mean, I think one the nation shared collectively, and that was the public murder of George Floyd. And if you remember back to that moment, where the national conversation happened with George Floyd's death was around his autopsy. The Hennepin County medical examiner coroner labeled his death a homicide. But if you look at the first, second, and third factors that contributed to his death, the very top of it was that George Floyd had a pre-existing heart condition that made it difficult for law enforcement to subdue him. Right. In other words, his bad heart made it necessary for police to use more force. And that was a contributing factor. And
And
that
all
to
the
me,
racist commentators came out of the woodwork to talk about previous drug use or whatever was in his background as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
fentanyl. They also
Right.
even said that he actually had sickling of his blood cells to suggest that he might have been a carrier of sickle cell trait. So even though the medical examiner claimed homicide, they pointed to all these other biological things that sort of minimize what Derek Chauvin and the other officers were doing that we all witnessed with our own eyes. And it's that
Right.
sort of arrogance and indifference to say, despite what the American public saw, we're going to still say that there was something wrong with George Floyd. And I wondered how many more George Floyds are there? And it began to sort of start an investigation looking at other high profile death cases. And that led me to a woman named Helen Jones here in Los Angeles, whose son, John Horton III, was a 22-year-old Black man who died in Men's Central Jail here in Los Angeles right before his 23rd birthday. And his death was staged to look like a suicide. He was someone who was in solitary confinement. When deputies supposedly found him, he was hanging. But when Helen got his body, she saw there were abrasions to his nose and eyes and forehead. He appeared to have been handcuffed and was being beaten. And there was a flesh wound around his wrist that suggested he was struggling. There was blood on his clothes, all of which was wildly inconsistent with both the reports of law enforcement and then also eventually the medical examiner, who changed the death from suicide to undetermined. And this started this really powerful collaboration between myself and other impacted families throughout the county of Los Angeles and really around the nation, who were also dealing with these records that were quite frankly lying and not telling the truth about why and how people lose their lives in police custody.
Yeah, I was really struck by that part of the book where you talk about Helen, the mother of John, and you give her a lot of credit for educating you about the death investigation system. And you talk a lot about including people that have lived experience with dealing with this system. And it reminded me of the slogan, "Nothing about us without us," a powerful refrain from like the disability rights movement or harm reduction movement or like Poor People's Campaign, many different types of movements. And it may seem obvious to you and me and many of the people watching, but given that so many discount the experiences and the expertise that everyday people have, what is it that spoke to you? What is so important about including people that have lived experience in this process?
So I come from a tradition where you have elders in your community that raise you from a small person. And they may not have education in any formal sense, but they're incredibly educated in the way the world works. And even though I'm an academic and have degrees and teach at, a fancy research institution, I've never lost sight of that. That has always sustained and carried me. And so when I met Helen Jones and many other families, Terry Lovett, for example, Polani Lucas, mothers who were figuring out on their own what really happened. Let me pull out an anatomy book. Let me pull out a legal dictionary. Let me look at other news stories so that I can make my experience intelligible to what's going on in the world. And when that was presented to me, there was no doubt in my mind, these impacted families, these courageous mothers understood something about this system because they lived it and they were on the margins. And I think that's something that's a kind of running thread in the history of this nation. It's very often people who are at the margins of our broken democratic systems who are dealing and shouldering the burden of our nation's contradictions that understand what we need to do to create solutions to actually change and build better institutions. And this began a really powerful and unprecedented partnership where reading a 30-page autopsy, it's a daunting thing. It's 35 pages. There's a lot of sort of mild medical details in there that
Absolutely.
to the casual observer may not make sense, but to a grieving mother who knows how to read this record, I was able to learn how to see a story embedded in these records that the death investigator didn't want to be told, and that these mothers had the vision and eyesight and the experience to not only see it, but to teach myself and all the many students who made up my lab here at UCLA.
How has this research that you've done, these investigations that you've done, how has this information been received?
Well, as you can imagine, there's a mixed reaction to this sort of work. On the one hand, I'm regularly contacted by impacted families, journalists, and other media who are also dealing with similar stories of medical examiners or coroners minimizing the death of a loved one or hiding records or making it difficult to understand what exactly happened. But on the other side, I think we are still a nation that has not overcome the conservative law and order politics that were set into motion by Nixon and then doubled down by Reagan and then eventually through Bill Clinton's crime bill in the 1990s, which
Absolutely.
really, I think, set up a binary where if you're a person in this country, either you are on the right side or the wrong side of the law, and there's no nuance in between. And so when you are in this sort of moral, political environment, it's a challenge to understand the fact that people are dying in custody. And no, it's not because they're sick and it's not because they're mentally ill. It's because we have a law enforcement institution and a law enforcement practice that ends people's lives. And we have district attorneys and legal immunity that allow this to happen. And we have a coroner system that protects this type of violence. And this is happening every day, every year for decades. I think that is something that's hard for people to respond and to think about. And they often get triggered. And there's a sense of, well, if we sort of reform this system, what are we going to do with the criminals? What are we going to do with people who break the law? And I think we need to reframe that. We need to realize no one is born a criminal. People are victims of policy violence. People are victims of states neglecting the American people and the American public. And if we want to be serious about crime prevention, we have to build institutions that take care of people, that give them dignity and purpose and see them as valuable beings and not merely sort of seeing them people as unworthy for democracy.
I think you can hear it coming through, but in the book, you call yourself a perpetual optimist. And I think it was nice to read that, especially in the context of such a dark and difficult topic, right? You say that you believe deaths in custody will stop when we recognize ourselves in the people in jails and prisons and handcuffs, the condemned, as you call them. Mm-hmm. And a lot of what I talk about on this channel is trying to get us to see our shared humanity, how complicated life is, how much is out of our control based on a lot of those structural and political factors and forces that create the conditions of our precarity. What do you see in your work as part of the key to getting people to see themselves in those that they are taught to view as other?
I think it's a few things. One is to, first of all, there's a measure of education that we have to do. We need to understand that this is a system that has happened and has existed without much accountability or reform for decades. I was able to find with my lab that between 2000 and 2020, law enforcement have killed around 32,104 people during arrests. And that's not including people in jail. That's just an arrest. Wow. But that is more than twice the number of people who have been executed in this nation's history going back to 1608. So just think about that. That's just a 20-year period. And so in a way, dying in custody, which has often happened before trial, before people go to court, before people have an opportunity to defend themselves in our court system, these people are dying before this process. I don't think any one of us want to live in a city or a nation where this happens, because this isn't safety. This isn't justice. This is something else. And I think it requires us to look at this with sort of courageous eyes to understand what kind of system that we live in and how we often vote at the ballot for this sort of system, given the elected officials that we appoint, who double down on these systems rather than trying to invest in alternatives to policing and incarceration. So I think that's part of it. But the other thing is that if you realize, well, how do people end up in custody to begin with? And you just look at the number of people, the ones that I've written about, the ones that we've reported about, a lot of them are nonviolent offenders, people who are dying because they're loitering and they are unhoused and they are being cited for public drunkenness, for example. Or there are people who are suffering from a mental health crisis and they call 911 rather than some other social worker who might actually de-escalate the situation and help them. So we're sending police to there. And if you think about people like this, we all have members in our family that are suffering from opioid addiction, that are struggling with mental health issues, that are weathering sort of a nation where inflation is out of control and they don't really know where their next meal is going to come from. And right now, politically, people don't have coverage for SNAP benefits and other things because we're playing politics with people's food and people's health. Like, those are the conditions that create death in custody. And I think we have to understand that in a nation state like this, where there's just danger and uncertainty everywhere, each and every one of us are one bad mental health day away from finding ourselves in police custody. And I think that's a tragedy that has to change. And I think when we begin to understand that these victims are no different than us, then we realize this is a system that we're implicated in and we can do something to change it.
Your book certainly educates people in that way. And I think that that's one of the reasons it's so important. I also thought about, in addition to education, like the failures of media, our institutions, poor messaging. And I thought of this poll that came out for New York City likely voters in September, where they asked two questions. Okay. One is, do you support or oppose the idea of defund the police? Okay. They asked this question and 10% said that they strongly support, 9% said they somewhat support. The next question they asked said, would you support or oppose cutting some of the police budget and using the money for social services, for instance, to help the homeless and the mentally ill? Defund the police, right? It's just not using the phrase. And the support jumps up to 32%, with somewhat support jumping up to 20%. Mm-hmm. So it's just a matter of messaging there, where defund the police was kind of weaponized by conservatives to mean something that it didn't actually mean. But when you actually break down what the phrase means, would you support redirecting these funds to other things? The public is in support of it. So I guess this is not really a question, I'm just ranting, but like, how much of it is, in addition to the education piece, messaging and media as part of this too, in getting people to understand the realities of what we're facing here in this system?
Absolutely. You're right there. And I think, and this goes back to something we were talking about a little bit earlier. I mean, the law and order politics in the 1990s, which, by the way, the Trump administration has recently signed executive orders dropping the age for minimum offenses in DC and other places, kind of reproducing some of the mistakes, the legislative mistakes of the time period. Fear around our safety is an incredibly motivating factor for us to sign off terrible things. Right. And I think for us to change this, you are right, is about messaging. And we also need media and journalists who are not interested in chasing headlines, but who are actually interested in disclosing truth and accountability and justice and democracy, to talk about what's happening to people who are dying in custody and humanize them. And the only way you can do that is if you sort of tell these stories and tell it with the kind of texture and complexity that keeps us mindful of the fact that this is a human life that was lost. This was a father or a sister or a mother or a brother that should still be with us. And I think that's the part of the story that I think we need leadership here on. And, again, it's no surprise that I think a lot of Americans feel the weight of this fear mongering that happens around these issues, because their values tell them something different. They say to them, I want to live in a city where people who are disadvantaged have an opportunity. Like, that's a great thing. Right. But if they're not finding those values mirrored in major media, they go to alternative media sources. They go to alternative voices like yours, for example, to understand what's really going on. And I think that's a positive thing. Mm-hmm. We need to continue to move in that direction, because in many ways, what it's telling us is that we are, in many ways, the people that we need, as Eddie Glaude reminds us, to create the kind of change that we want. And this is including the impacted family member, to the investigative journalists, to the witness, to all of these things. I think that's the kind of institutions we have to design if we want to get out of this mess.
And you do talk about that in the book as well, the community responses to these abuses. You talk about like the people's justice movement, restorative justice, transformative justice, these different approaches. What are some of the structures of accountability for law enforcement that you feel need to be at the top of the list for ensuring accountability and reform? What are some of the things that these movements are doing to change the system that you want to highlight?
Yeah, these are great questions. I think the question around accountability is also a question about transparency. And so I think in the civil rights, social justice, abolitionist circles that I travel in, that I'm embedded in, there is a vision that says we don't want anyone to die in jail. We don't want anyone to die in police custody. So how do we create systems that do that? Because there's a sense of the way law enforcement has been socialized over the last few decades, there's not a lot of trust that police are going to get this right. So let's create alternatives to policing. So that's, if it's a jail facility, create county level facilities for beds for people who are unhoused, or beds for people who are suffering with mental illness. Do not put them in jails with people who are struggling or don't put them in jail with people who have violent offenses, for example. Don't put them in institutions that we know are not going to give them the kind of care they need. That's step one. So limiting contact with police is huge. And I think a lot of the restorative justice, transformative justice movements are doing exactly like that, doing exactly this issue by trying to create civic run courts, essentially. And we're seeing this in places like in Brooklyn, we're seeing this in Baltimore, where civilians are coming together for themselves, for themselves to, resolve a range of disputes that don't involve law enforcement and policing. I think it's a good thing. It's a sign of a healthy democracy if your citizens can govern themselves in these ways. But aside from that, before we get fully to a sort of future that we all want, I think we need to have very basic things like in most states, for example, there are very loose public record laws that allow law enforcement to take a death record off of the public record. So the state of California, for example, death records are supposedly written in the public's interest, but sheriffs and law enforcement can take any death record and put it indefinitely on security hold, which means it's unavailable to media, it's unavailable to social justice organizations, in some cases not even available to family. That sort of weaponizing the records of what happened creates this sort of vacuum that has to change.
Right. It just makes it that much easier to cover bad behavior.
Absolutely. It makes it more difficult to cover for bad behavior, but then it also allows for these really problematic narratives around these people were sick, this person was a threat, to sort of thrive in the absence of truth and information. I think we have to sort of dismantle that system. I think also we really need to push our district attorneys around the nation for a progressive agenda that rethinks law and order politics, because that gets in the way. Because very often DAs are not going to prosecute police and law enforcement who take people's lives. So that's another thing that needs to happen. And the third thing I think is that there needs to be pressure at the local state level to make sure medical examiners and coroners are doing their due diligence. In many states, the medical examiner or coroner has the discretion to even do an autopsy. They're not mandated to do it. There's only a handful of states where an autopsy is absolutely mandated, right? Those states are Illinois, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Nevada, and Wisconsin. Every other state, the medical examiner can choose to do an autopsy or not. And that can make the difference for a family that's trying to figure out answers and trying to figure out what exactly happened. We need to revise those records and revise those laws, I should say, to really make sure that when someone dies in state custody, there's a proper investigation done, ideally a third-party investigation that's unaligned with law enforcement or not aligned with the local county that's going to pay financial settlements. So we need a third-party review system to ensure that these records are telling us the truth. So I think those are some of the tools that we should be thinking about. And there are organizations all around the nation that are already working on these issues. They're often dealing with a lot of pushback from elected officials because they're changing things. And I think, we can get involved in these movements when we learn about them. And I think that these movements need the energy right now in this moment as we're really questioning where the future of our democracy is going.
Yeah, and it is a scary time for our democracy. I think another important stop for people is your book, and they definitely need to read it. I think in particular, the final chapter is just like a mic drop. As I was reading it, I was like, I wish that I could print this out and give this to every single person. Like it was so transformative. I think that everyone needs to read this book, and I am so thankful for the opportunity to read it and learn from you. I do have one more question for you though, Dr. Keel, before you go. And I ask this of everyone who comes and visits the show, to encourage the audience to change their mind with new evidence or as their understanding of the evidence changes. What is the most recent thing you changed your mind about?
Great question. We just recently witnessed two important things that really changed my mind. One was the passage of Proposition 50 in the state of California.
Yes.
But then also the victory of Mamdani in New York.
Yes.
And what that has told me is that there is a new silent majority in this nation. And that silent majority has progressive values and cares about democracy. And that silent majority is not scared to stand up for what they believe in, and are also not going to be converted with the kind of violence that we're seeing right now in our elected officials, and particularly in the White House. And so that, to me, is a very powerful thing that I'm sort of really sitting with in this moment, realizing that the future is much brighter than we realize. We need to continue to build on this momentum. Nihilism doesn't win. I think that Americans are much more kind and thoughtful than we often give ourselves credit for. And we just have to have the sort of elected officials and leaders, and they're not always elected officials. Sometimes we are the leaders that actually reflect these values and build them into our institutions. And so for me, seeing that we have a new silent majority is something that has changed the way I've thought about what we are as a nation and where we're going.
That is so beautiful. And I almost was getting emotional listening to you talk. I think because I spent most of the day yesterday crying because I was so relieved and happy. And Memdani's victory speech is something that I think I may listen to once a week, like just to remind myself that like someone like that exists in a position of power is a remarkable thing.
It is.
Yeah. So thank you so much for being here. I encourage everyone to read your book. You can see the link in the description or in the pinned comment to get your copy. It is out today. Please go and get it. Please read it. And thank you very much, Dr. Keel. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.